India, being a massive protrusion into a body of water that has an otherwise circular coastline, was since early times an umbilical hub for cross-oceanic trade, from Europe and Arabia to China and Oceania. This allowed for a fluid transfer of ideas and customs in the region. Indian culture traversed the ocean, and the subcontinent even lent to the surrounding waters its name. Yet overseas civilizations gave to India just as much as they borrowed. Because the subcontinent's dominant religion, Hinduism, was firmly grounded in Indian culture and landscape, the native population of the coast tended to be quite averse to the long, international voyages that a medieval trader could be expected to undertake. Instead, business-oriented Hindus provided financial scaffolding for mercantile enterprise, usually being at the helm of banking institutions you could find in India's internationally bound entrepôts and trading cities. Because of this, minority and foreign faith groups such as Jains, Zoroastrians, and Muslims were the predominant demographic of merchants. In particular, Muslims conducted active proselytization campaigns throughout India's coastline, establishing families, religious buildings, and communities in India's major port cities. This happened in tandem with the expansion of Afghan, Persian, and Turkic sultanates throughout much of modern-day Pakistan and into the Indo-Gangetic Plain. The first Islamic empire to make an excursion into India was the Ghaznavids, and because of their Persian origins, Iranian culture and Indian Islam became inextricably linked for several centuries. This kingdom, however, would not be an enduring presence. Its Iranian territories were conquered by the Seljuks in the 1040s, giving the Sultanate a definitively South Asian character. Though slavery was prevalent throughout Indian Muslim realms, it definitely didn't parallel the indignity and barbarity of the slave trade chatteldom you may be thinking of. Slavery in this region was foremost a military institution. Turkic slaves were particularly prized for their fidelity and discipline. The fact that Sultan slaves often fought to succeed his throne after manumission and regency shows that the kind of bondage that existed here did not come with heaps of dishonor, and in many cases slaves even practiced the antithesis of servitude, social mobility. A growing class of people would settle down in urban or farming communities, becoming literate and interconnected with a wider Persian literary sphere. Come the advent to Iran of Mongol invasion and the influx of Persian refugees fleeing from the cataclysmic terror left on the tracks of this pillaging horde empire, combined with the fact that Indian mothers' wombs produce faster than assault rifles, and Persianate Indian domains became the new center of gravity for Iranian culture. Around this time, the Ghurids, a pastoral people whose origin comprises a lacuna in our history, entered the Indian subcontinent by conquering the Punjab by 1186 and making their way across the Indo-Gangetic Plain all the way to Bengal. Large swaths of India would be incorporated into the Dar al-Islam, or Islamic world, yet unlike in other regions, conversion en masse would not follow the explosive, pun intended, conquest of Muslim empires. Conversion to Islam, when it did happen, was often a temporal calculation made to enhance the new follower's social or economic standing. Much of the Muslim clergy despised an Indian sultan's typical nonchalance with regards to prevalent Hindu idolatry in their kingdoms, but as Islam was a minority faith ruling strenuously over a Hindu majority, perhaps Muslim rulers had no such capacity otherwise. In the remains of the Ghurid realm would coalesce several successor dynasties, the first of which was a Mamluk slave kingdom, and the most powerful of which was the monarchic Tughlaq dynasty. Under them, various regions of India, north and south, would be encompassed by the excursions of their Islamic empire. Yet Islam was becoming less of an excursion and more of a permanent force. It's perhaps inaccurate to emphasize religion in the descriptions and nomenclature applied to the conquests of certain empires. Non-religious aspects of these events are pushed to the historiographical periphery in favor of an India that one can easily mistake as a dichotomy of Hindus and Muslims, two purportedly self-aware, monolithic, and incompatible communities. This sidelines the prevalent cosmopolitanism, syncretism, and eclecticism, as well as cultural dimensions of the era, in favor of a narrative that the region's modern nation-states must find congenial, if bias and nitpicking are properly used tools. Anyways, the decline of the Delhi Sultanate, a catch-all term for the dynasties that took up the reins of the Ghurid realm, was principally caused by its inability to set up a strong dynastic lineage or regal succession system, the result of which was fratricidal succession wars prefacing just about every new reign. This problem would be endemic to future Indo-Muslim empires, yet the influence of the Sultanate had been cemented. A new religion and new culture had been introduced to the entire subcontinent. Following Delhi's demise, a politically fractured period began in India. These circumstances were hardly new to many places. The politics of South India in particular was always multidimensional. Within kingdoms existed a mosaic of smaller titles and realms, and within those smaller realms existed even smaller dominions, making for intricate and complicated power dynamics. Yet the next all-encompassing Indian empire would not be an ingrowth started by one of these local kingdoms. Once again, an Islamic conqueror would come to the subcontinent from the north. The north, however, would be invaded by Islamic conquerors from the north even before India. The Turkic-Mongol warlord Timur followed in the footsteps of Genghis Khan, a great figure whom he secured the prestige of a conjugal descendants from, beginning in Samarkand and leading plundering forces throughout Iran, Iraq, Anatolia, and more. He even made a brief sojourn into the subcontinent, where he raided Delhi and exterminated as many as 80,000 locals. With no intention to be the hegemon of this region, however, his true territorial aspirations directed him and his armies over to China. Before he could even attempt a conquest of the Far East, however, he was stopped by a common Chinese defense mechanism: disease. Though the imperial vessel of Timur and his progeny would disappear slowly from the map from his death in 1405 to the early 1500s, certain children of the great Emir would build empires of their own. The one that we shall specifically focus on today is Babur. Timur bequeathed to his children the idea that, as Timurids, they had the right to rule their very own section of the world. To carve out a slice of the map for themselves was a birthright. This exhortation, passed down by his great-great-great-grandfather, very likely influenced the young Babur when his domain in the Fergana Valley was conquered by Uzbek warlords, for the young ruler decided to embark on an arduous journey south, through the Hindu Kush, to set up a new dominion in the city of Kabul. In 1504, he dethroned the city's loathed ruler and made it his own. He went on to achieve miraculous and outnumbered victories over local Afghan kingdoms, as a watershed event came in 1526 when he defeated and destroyed the Lodi dynasty, the decaying remnant of the Delhi Sultanate. Though a great conqueror, Babur also wrote many amusing things about the natural beauties around him. His musings upon Indian scenery and landscape can be found in his great memoir, the Baburnama. He appears to have been more interested in South Asia's flora and fauna than the locals, and was quite loquacious on the topic of Indian fruit quality. Some foods, like apples and bananas, delighted him. Others, like the main antagonist of his memoir, the jackfruit, he emphatically compared to sheep intestines. Of his conquered Indian subjects and their land, he wrote, rather brusquely, "Hindustan is a country of few charms. Its people have no good looks. Of social intercourse there is none. Of genius and capacity none. Of manners none. In handicraft and work there is no form or symmetry, method or quality. There are no good horses, no good dogs, no grapes, melons, or first-rate fruits, no ice or cold water, no colleges, no candles, torches, or candlesticks." Babur would live and die a pious Muslim. His successor, Humayun, who took the throne in 1530, would not be as fortunate a monarch. An inept commander who lacked his father's perceptiveness, his reign saw the temporary ascendancy of Mughal rivals. An invasion by the Kingdom of Gujarat was prevented militarily, but soon after Humayun was deposed and exiled in 1540 by the calculating Afghan noble Sher Shah. Proving to be a brilliant administrator, Sher Shah led his territory where the Mughals had once lain into prosperity. Humayun was forced to take a long, hazardous peregrination towards Kabul and eventually into the empire of Safavid Persia. There he won the Sultan's favor, performed a few Shia Muslim rituals to give off the impression he had converted, and then marched on to northern India with a Safavid army to reclaim his empire. Sher Shah had passed, his successors were ineffectual leaders, and Humayun won his territory back in 1555. The Mughal Empire, as this dominion was now known, was until this point more of a sprawling occupation than a settled bureaucracy. Its legitimacy came from the prestige of its ruling family's descendants from the great conqueror Timur. The empire made no pretense to hold any mystical or religious significance as many Islamic contemporaries did. Despite having spent just about his whole time as ruler on a perilous sojourn, Humayun was soon to meet something even more dastardly, his Achilles heel. It was a library staircase, which he fell and died on. His successor, however, would bring his dominion from a straggling sovereignty into a splendorous world empire. Under Akbar, the empire would be given a new identity. Inheriting the throne at age 13 in the year of 1556, he took up reins at a time when Mughal enemies were scattered but strong. Afghan nobles were displaced from their conquered homeland and had fled as far east as Bengal, while hostile Rajput lineages dominated the region of Rajasthan. The first group he would eliminate through rudimentary conquest of the Indo-Ganges, but with the Rajputs he would establish a relationship that soon became a central facet of Mughal stability. The Rajputs were a large cluster of Hindu lineages in the region of Rajasthan, who gained notoriety as skilled warriors who valued bravery and martyrdom. When the leaders of these clans began marrying their daughters to high Mughal officials in exchange for positions in the Mughal aristocracy, suddenly the empire's ruling class had become an amalgam and microcosm of the cultures and faiths that inhabited North India. The empire also secured a high-quality source of something much needed in India's fractured period: military labor. For this reason, this alliance must have come in handy when Akbar seized militarily the port of Gujarat and took control of the many remunerative trade routes that flowed out from that world-class city. He even spread Mughal authority into the Deccan Peninsula, amassing colossal armies as big as 80,000 strong and putting fragmented Shia Islamic kingdoms at his mercy by besieging important forts. Just as all this upheaval was going on in India and a new world-class state was being built, foreign navigators and traders were happening upon the subcontinent. The Portuguese were, at the time, discoverers par excellence, and they had gotten to the Indian Ocean first. On the landmass that was that sea's namesake, they introduced gunpowder, which suffered early setbacks, but proved a decisive factor in a battle precipitating the decline of the powerful Hindu Vijayanagara Empire. Akbar aligned himself with this group of Europeans who had a monopoly on India's interactions with Europe, with the stipulation that they stop sinking ships of the Mecca pilgrims. The Portuguese also sent a few Jesuit missionaries over who tried to convince locals of the gospel of Christ, using charismatic methods of preaching. They would use genocide, but soon realized that technique only worked on one kind of Indian. There was perhaps no Mughal emperor more willing to tolerate their evangelical endeavors. Akbar's idiosyncratic and eclectic religious attitude was the most distinctive aspect of his reign. Theological debates were a regular part of court life, and Akbar found himself quickly disenchanted with dogmatic Islam, being angered immensely by the corruption in the worldly ummah he saw around him. Today, he is viewed as an apostate by many Muslims. Though some characterizations are exaggerated, it is true that he turned away from traditional Islamic practice after much of the clergy supported a usurper to the throne. He became vegetarian, engaged in Parsi fire rituals, showed great admiration for Hindu rites, and he even formed his own spiritual program, which combined aspects of the many different religions he had come into contact with in imperial circles. The main adherents of this rather diminutive movement were a group of learned disciples, all of them cloistered within extravagant court life, who developed a master-slave-like relationship to the emperor. They submitted to him in a religious fashion that angered many devout Muslims, who saw God, or Allah, as the only one to be submitted to in this way. To the Portuguese, the emperor was an interesting prospect for proselytization who never came to pass. When their jejune attempts at mass conversion of the Mughal nobility came up short, these Europeans saw fit to just steal the port of Goa and remake its architecture along a congenial Western mold. To an empire the scale of the Mughals, however, this was a paltry conquest. Under Akbar, prosperous swaths of productive agricultural land had been incorporated into the empire. The rural aristocracy of the countryside had been penetrated, giving way to a new class of settlers who had been crafted and subsidized by the imperial policies that intruded rural lifestyles. Among the emperor's subjects, Akbar accrued an image of infallibility, of an adept ruler who commanded a prodigious empire through astounding victory after astounding victory. The Mughal Empire was a sublime realm for all the world to see, and its next two rulers would enjoy the fruits of imperial prosperity as well as the opulent life bestowed naturally to the one true Emperor of India. Jahangir, the third son of Akbar, ascended to the throne in 1605 at the age of 36. Good auspices for a Mughal ruler, there was no especially bloody conflict for succession to the throne. He only had to lock a single son in a river fortress for trying to depose him. However, one of his early actions did presage trouble to come for the Mughal Empire. The Sikhs were a group of people who followed the movement of Sikhism, started in the 1500s. The Sikh religion is a faith whose credo emphasizes transcendence of worldly cycles and perversions, the cycle of life and death, the corruption of the socio-economic establishment, the imperious gender and class divisions within a society, and more. This ideology of numinous equality translated into charitable Sikh institutions such as communal kitchens and the non-dynastic succession of Sikh gurus, or spiritual leaders of the community. The fifth of these gurus, Arjan, was tortured and executed by Jahangir's ordinance in 1606 for supporting his pretender son. This watershed moment turned Arjan into a martyr for the Sikh faith, and envenomed the relationship between the religious group and the empire, a relationship which would end in slaughter centuries down the line. Jahangir, however, had many more relationships to tend to. The emperor sported so many wives that you could put a clothing line out of business by trying to Islamically dress all of them. The most notable of his spouses, however, was Nur Jahan. The most powerful empress in Mughal history, she was the putative power behind the throne for much of Jahangir's short reign. She took shrewdly to imperial politics and the minute details of administrating a sovereignty as large as the Mughal Empire, allowing Jahangir time to enjoy a simple, tranquil life as a nature enthusiast and aesthetic. The most enriching conquest of his reign was that of Bengal, a region enticed by benign submission more than overcome by the sword. Much in line with the methods by which it was incorporated, this region would be a prosperous but loosely ruled territory. Eastward progression of the empire was halted by the Ahoms, a militarily skillful and mobilized people above the border of Burma and Bangladesh. To the west, the Mughals did not meet so much of a robust people as they did a world-class empire, the Safavid Persians. The emperors of Iran and India during this period maintained very personal relations, viewing each other with proud esteem, as equals in their position at the helm of distinguished empires. Ambivalence pervaded diplomacy between the realms. The magnanimity extended to the Mughal Emperor Humayun in his time of most need long ago was not forgotten, but border skirmishes erupted in the fault line between these two states, especially on important forts. No outsider, however, would pose an existential threat to an empire such as the Mughals. By masterfully handling a succession crisis in the wake of his father, Jahangir's terminal illness, Shah Jahan came to power in 1628. He did not share the libertine religious attitudes of the two emperors before him, and because the structure of the Mughal state allowed a ruler's personality to become the zeitgeist of his era, the empire saw a return to orthodox Islamic practice. A more material facet of Shah Jahan's character was his architectural inclination. The peacock throne was erected as a new chair fit for royals. It was bejeweled to the maxim with rubies, emeralds, and sapphires displaying the most ornate craftsmanship the empire had to offer. A more grandiose project was the Taj Mahal, an enduring symbol of India and what was most likely the superlative achievement in architecture of Shah Jahan's reign. The word Mughal was introduced to Western vocabulary as a term for a person of great wealth and power. This is demonstrative of two things: the increasing decadence, worldliness, and extravagance of the Mughal court life, as well as the increasingly keen interest Europeans took to the region. Regardless, the Mughal Empire could be considered to be at the height of its splendor in this age. Imperial borders crystallized, and though there were some extremities of the empire's political culture that would need to be pruned, the state situation was for the most part stable. The emperor to come would cause a few disruptions to the Mughal way of government, but prefacing his reign would be a rather typical event: civil war. Aurangzeb was someone who we'd colloquially call a badass. He was pioneering the inventive new sport of elephant fighting at the age while you were still in school learning what an angle was. Known as a stalwart, calculating, collected commander, his leadership skills would be brought to the test for a different sport, a Mughal classic, family homicide. His primary opponent, Dara Shikoh, was less inclined to demonstrate bravery with the sword and more inclined towards elegance of the mind. Dara Shikoh's thinking was very much aligned with generations of Indian syncretic movements, as well as the ideologies of the Emperor Akbar. He believed that the Vedic Upanishads, works of Hindu philosophy, were to be treated as companions to the Islamic Quran, and thought the religion shared many impulses and intuitions. In his treatise on comparative religion, The Confluence of the Two Oceans, he espoused a perennialist philosophy and the belief that Hindus and Muslims could achieve unity through faith. To this end, he translated notable Vedic and Islamic texts into languages that India's two religious groups could understand. Putting its primary combatants side by side, we can see that the Mughal War of Succession pitted two characters, their personalities, idiosyncrasies, and beliefs against each other. Viewed more sociologically, it was the confrontation of two views on what should bind Mughal society together. Ultimately, Aurangzeb had the commanding ability to back his claim to power with military victories. His early campaigns were successful and decisive, while Dara Shikoh spent the whole war executing his master plan of running away. The strategy failed, similarly to his life, which ended promptly upon his capture and imprisonment. Whilst the conflict wasn't as political or religious as contemporary politics begs to remember, the onset of Aurangzeb's reign would bring profound changes to Mughal society and identity. The new emperor's interpretation of Islam was dogmatic, puritanical, and austere, contrasting with the liberal attitudes of prior reigns. The court life, often the soul of the ruling class, is a great example of this. Musical concerts were ended, alcohol was prohibited, and a lifestyle that could be considered decadent, expensive, ignorant, mystical, invigorating, and a source of patronage all at the same time ceased to exist. Aurangzeb took punctiliously to the very intricate details of governing India. Perhaps he was diligent to a fault. while the emperors before him were aloof and unconcerned in allowing their subordinates large power in steering imperial administration. While they took to artistic and aesthetic fancies, he was notably bad at delegating authority, paranoid of what powerful inferiors could do in a nation famous for civil strife and a recalcitrant nobility. Aurangzeb wasn't physically encumbered by his work, however, as most of his reign would be spent abroad, on military campaigns in hostile territory, trying to subdue a situation that had been spearheaded by a Hindu ruler named Shivaji. Aurangzeb was very familiar with the region where this struggle took place, the Deccan. Prior to the War of Succession, he was on the cusp of a breakthrough and struggle with the sultanates of Bijapur and Golconda. Yet when he had to leave and tend to a massive internal struggle back home, a battered region with an unnatural power vacuum was left, a propitious mix of circumstances for rebellion and the inception of a young empire. In the declining Bijapur kingdom, Shivaji, a leader of the Hindu Maratha clan, carved himself a realm through military victory, referred from now on as the Maratha Kingdom or Empire. Soon after seizing the throne, Aurangzeb returned to the region with a massive force intent on acquiring submission from the movement, putting the Mughal Deccan in such a precarious position. This he did. The size of imperial armies forced the young Maratha realm to yield. Yet, it appears Shivaji was not a ruler to be contained. His treachery against the empire persisted, and in 1674 the whole ruse was thrown off as he crowned himself king of an independent nation. That his coronation ceremony involved Hindu rituals was a momentous proclamation of a new geopolitical force, and an eschewing of centuries of Islamic preeminence in India. Purposeful as it all was, the establishment of the Maratha Empire would not go unopposed, the Mughal emperor being their most dogged opponent. Aurangzeb could perhaps humble the Maratha claim to statehood by utilizing blunt force on the Deccan, punishing kingdoms of fickle loyalty and varying religions through invasion and fratricide, but all sorts of intangibles such as morale, leadership, and mobility allowed Maratha cavalry to be an uncounterable force in the region. Due to this, Aurangzeb would spend the better half of his reign as a Sisyphus of war, trying his best with a gigantic force at his side to destroy decentralized insurgency. In this task, he enjoyed only capricious support from the governors of the Mughal Deccan. Being culturally detached from the Northern Empire, their loyalty was strained, and they frequently sided with the Maratha raiders. Insubordination could not just be found on newly molded imperial frontiers, but also as a corrosive in some crucial relationships of Mughal society as well. After the execution of yet another Sikh guru in 1675, a long history of appalling crimes committed against the Sikh people culminated in a brief outburst of appalling crimes committed by the Sikh people in a successful campaign for a separatist republic in the Punjab. Aurangzeb's re-implementation of the jizya, a legalistic Islamic tax on non-believers, caused great stir and protest among Hindu subjects who felt this an especially overbearing measure. It is reported that one day they gathered en masse in front of a masjid to block Aurangzeb on his way to prayer, and they were charged by war elephants for doing so. Even the fidelity of the Rajput clan towards the Mughals, a vital and ancient allegiance, was ruptured. These many emergent crises in the core of the empire could have used an emperor vigilant to the state of Mughal administration. Perhaps Aurangzeb fit that role early on, but he spent a great deal of pertinent time on a forlorn war in the Deccan in his latter reign. This war came with few spoils, but sure demanded a great spoiling. It was expensive and fruitless, draining the treasury even further. It can be obviously seen, therefore, that Aurangzeb's death augured bad times ahead for the empire, even if the emperor himself had no lack of personal amenities and is exalted by many modern Muslims for respectable reasons. In the last few years of his life, Aurangzeb used astrology to portend bad times to come for the Mughal state. We can only wonder if he truly believed in this type of prediction, or if it was simply his way of packaging the premonition that come his death, the empire would be left in dire straits. After Aurangzeb, Mughal emperors would be weak, ephemeral, inept, frivolous, indulgent, and unremarkable. None were really able to define and steer the culture or situation of the empire as prior sovereigns could, and Aurangzeb had a hand in bringing this about. I talked very much of each man's idiosyncrasies when discussing prior emperors, perhaps even more than the impact they had on the empire itself. This is because very personal components of these men's characters often define their reign. Akbar's religious tolerance and studiousness, Jahangir's aloofness allowing his more citizen-keen spouse to take charge, Shah Jahan's architectural passion manifesting in grandiose icons of the Indian subcontinent, and then there's Aurangzeb. Extraordinary character though he was, that didn't manifest much in his style of governance, for he tried to base the contracts binding Mughal society together to impersonal and rigid Islamic law. His academic magnum opus, the Fatwa Alamgiri, was a great collection of treatises, principles, and instructions of the Sharia to be distributed to judges and jurists throughout the empire, replacing the muddled, ill-understood legal system of yesteryear. However great this achievement was, it showed the empire moving away from a long tradition of libertine religious pluralism and towards a more austere, parochial political culture. Attached to this was the end of the mystical, transcendent image of awe fashioned by Mughal rulers towards themselves, as well as the old foundation of the empire as upon the prestige of the Timurid family. To add one complication atop another, the imperial treasury was now all but dried up, and Aurangzeb's upheaval of the political order would not stop the Mughals' perennial issue, succession war. Coming out of the 1707 iteration was a gifted ruler ready to pioneer a new age of glory for Islamic India, but don't blink or you'll miss it. He died after 5 years, and the empire's territory began receding to critical states come yet another throne dispute afterwards. Mughal emperors after Aurangzeb were prone to take more conciliatory stances towards the Maratha threat, offering aid in civil strife and legitimacy to the rising kingdom, indicative of a shifting power balance on the subcontinent. The complete dissonance of authority from Delhi caused regions that prospered fine enough on their own to distance themselves from the incoherence of imperial politics, gradually breaking off from the Mughal state from the 1710s through 30s, a period during which the Timurid family was even deposed once in internal war. One glimmer of hope for the situation was a competent administrator of Bengal whose financial reforms helped establish a considerable and consistent revenue stream for the empire, yet upon his death in 1739, local administrators ceased sending any finance to the government, recognizing officially the prosperous province's de facto independence. The empire was all but bankrupt by the 1740s, most of its territories having severed connections or joined the rising Maratha sphere. All this territorial, fiscal, and economic erosion of the 18th century manifested in dramatic episodes showing the humbling of a once great empire, such as the 1740 sack of Delhi by an Iranian Shah. Yet the power to truly replace the Mughals on the subcontinent would not come from the south, north, east, or west, but from the waters. The British established a base of operations in Kolkata, defeated the Mughals militarily, and from there swept across large swaths of land aided by demand for European weaponry and a growing age of commerce and mercantilism in India. The Mughal Empire had a particularly large boon to manufacturing on the subcontinent. A nouveau riche bureaucracy oversaw the growth of industry in market towns, spurred on by demand for ornate and lavish goods enjoyed by aristocracies from Delhi to London to Amsterdam. The availability of capital, a famous accomplishment of the Mughals being imperial currency, empowered local populations to raise armies and resist archaic empires, as well as allowed for the entry of a new, business-savvy, advanced colonial power. British India would be a negligently ruled place, millions dying from plague and famine, but at least the Queen got a nifty new jewel in her hat, so I guess it all worked out in the end. The Mughals would be tolerated for a short while under this newfangled order, until the last little flame of the empire was extinguished as an insignificant Pali swept up by a failed rebellion in 1857. No doubt the end of Islamic reign in India was a traumatic moment for the subcontinent's Muslim community. Many had their livelihoods in the ulma and religious bureaucracy that had been propped up by imperial governance. Under secular rule, Christian occupation, and Hindu preponderance, the religious group divorced themselves from an all-encompassing Indian identity, instead perceiving each other as a distinct peoplehood separate from the rest of society. The ulma associated this nadir of Islamic power with a lapse in devotion of Muslims as a spiritual community. When these varying ideas were synthesized into a movement, they gained enough influence to erect the Islamic State of Pakistan in 1947, based on rough religious majority geographic divisions. Both India and Pakistan look to differing parts of Mughal history for inspiration. Muslims see an eidolon of piety and devotion in the Emperor Aurangzeb. Other faiths admire the tolerance of the Emperor Akbar. Though its dominance over India may have collapsed some 200 years ago, the seismic legacy of the Mughal Empire is felt by hundreds of millions of people to this very day.